I will hold on a second while it connects. So this is the IETF Newcomers Overview. As Rich already indicated, I'm Karen Donahue, and this is Rich Sauls, and we're going to be providing an overview for this evening. And with that, we represent the IETF Edu team. There'll be some information about it at the very end, but feel free to reach out to us at any point with any questions. And with that, Rich, I'll give it to you.
Sure. Okay, so welcome. They say start off with a joke, so I'll start with a joke. For those in the US or watching the results, we will keep this seminar as a safe space, and in spite of our desire to avoid it, we will not run until 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. So we'll finish on time, we'll help room for questions, and then we can all get back to biting our nails. So as Karen mentioned, she and I are part of the Edu team. Actually, we're the co-chairs, I guess. That is one of the groups within the IETF that works to provide these kinds of educational offerings. We also provide other newcomers activities that are mentioned in the webpage. Everyone should have gotten an email. If you didn't, let us know by clicking something in the chat room, typing something in the chat room. All of the slides are available off the newcomers page, which will show up in the chat room. It should also be in the email you got. And all of when you see the hard copy, the PDF, all of the links on there will be live. We checked them out earlier today, so everything points to the right stuff. So, welcome. First, the first definition, a newcomer in the IETF terminology is someone who's attended up to 5 meetings. We meet 3 times a year, so that means you can, if you so choose, identify, as a newcomer for the first 2 years of your involvement. A first timer is obviously someone who this is their first time. Okay, so let's get into it. Welcome. We will be, this presentation will cover 3 sections. Introduction to newcomers activities, the IETF structure, what the IETF week is like. Obviously with the virus, it's all online and virtual, so it's different than some of the face-to-face things we have. And then we'll finish with pointing out some of the key people and resources that are available to you if you get lost or confused or are harassed or bothered. Pardon me. We'll end each section with a chance to ask questions. Do that by saying, plus or hands up in the chat. Don't click raise hand in the participant list because that's harder to see. We have to scroll through it. But whoever's not talking, right now it would be Karen. When she presents, it would be me. We'll keep an eye open on the chat room and then, name you, and then you can sort of unmute and ask your question or type it into the chat room if you prefer. This newcomers presentation has been part of the history of the IETF for a very, very long time. Scott Bradner and Mike St. John's are 2 graybeards, as we call them. Scott's since retired, Mike is still around, who have done the earlier versions of this thing and presented it for a very long time. So, page 3, the note well. So because we're a standards organization, an SDO, we have to have certain policies. And so this and the next slide talk about what the legal impacts or the legal ramifications are of your participation. By the time you're at the end of the note well, by the time you're at the end of the week, the chairs will just be saying, okay, here's the note well, you've seen it before, any questions, good, move on. There are, you don't have to read this now, it's what we call an eye chart slide, a lot of very small print. But it talks about what rights are involved if you participate, meaning you can't keep patent information secret. You have to respect the participants who are involved. Karen, if you go on to the next slide, please. This is the number of documents. It talks about how the standards work, the flow through the IETF, how the working group works. The working group is, there's like 130 of them, is how the real work gets done, which is preparing documents. Anti-harassment procedures, code of conduct, copyright. When you write a draft, you are turning over the copyright to the IETF corporation. And there's certain rights that you maintain, but certain rights you also give up when you participate, and a privacy policy and so on. All of these links are live. The Notewell itself is on the IETF website fairly prominently. And then from there, you can click and read all of the other things, should you need to, or you should at least feel free to do so. If you haven't done it yet, on the bottom of the Zoom window, there's a little chat button with a speech balloon. Pop that open if you can and move it off to the side so you can ask questions there, as Karen is monitoring that right now. Next slide. So we have a lot of newcomer activities or things designed to orient newcomers and make the week that's coming up in mid-November useful and productive for you and therefore the IETF. So this is the first of 2 webinars we're giving. The next one, 18 hours from now, no, 36 hours from now, is it's the same as this. We'll just be switching speaking positions. So if you come here and you don't have questions, then you don't have to come to the next one. There is a virtual quick connections. This will be held in one of the social rooms online, virtual. I'll show you some slides of that, where you just, a group of people, you go from table to table, and there are experienced IETF people on a number of areas: security, transportation, routing, the domain system, and they can there to answer your questions. And it's kind of like a speed dating thing. 10 minutes, move to the next table. So it's mainly about getting recommendations for contacts and connecting, names with faces if possible, virtually. The coffee breaks are in the morning before the sessions start, and will be in the same place as the quick connections, and it's just a social gathering, talk, meet other people who have been here the first time, or are newcomers or first timers. Can make some good friends that way. There will also be experienced people around to answer questions and so on. The guides mentoring has signups going on now, so that there's somebody who commits to being available to you all week during the IETF meetings. And so you can message them, chat with them, email, and so on. All of the information, and there's a full page write-up, is on the newcomers page that's listed there at the top of the slide. Okay. One of yeah, okay, I'll come back to that later, so sorry. Next slide, please. So how to prepare for an IETF meeting. See the link. So this information is stuff that's designed to be immediately available and useful to you. We don't cover at all the history. We don't cover how to write standards. We don't cover how to, say, oh, I want to do this new topic of work, right? It's just like, here's the groups that are meeting, and here's how to get into all of them. And here's how to start participating, hit the ground running, as the phrase goes. So you don't have to sort of look around and then say, oh yeah, I know something about network routing, or I know something about how DNS operates. I want to be able to participate in these things. And this is very, very much a pragmatic orientation for that. Do we have any questions at this point?
We have one that says, how long do these sessions go? And for 1 hour.
Yeah, if you mean this session being the tutorial, that's an hour. We try to leave 10-15 minutes at the end for questions. The working group sessions have different time slots, and the chairs have picked, you know, if they want to meet for 60 minutes, they want to meet for 90 minutes, or 2 hours, which is, yeah, different by the working group, but this session is an hour. Okay, next slide. So now I'll give a brief talk about where the IETF fits into the organization, the whole ecosystem that's around the IETF. So next slide, please. Okay, so our mission. I'll read this out loud. The mission of the IETF is to make the internet work better by providing high quality, relevant technical documents that influence the way people design, use, and manage the internet. Now, one phrase you hear a lot is we're not the protocol police, as in if you do something that doesn't meet, you know, the HTTP 1.1 spec, there's nothing we're going to do about it. You know, we're not going to come and turn off your router. But the purpose of all of what we write is, and it goes back to the very first the very original definition of RFC, which is request for comments. If you want to work with the other people on the internet in this area, then these are the guidelines for how you should do it. And the standards language has phrases like you must do this, or you should do this, or you should not do that. But it's up to the individual installations, software developers, and so on to write things. We want to develop things that are useful, that's functional. It can do what it's needed. It's scalable. We want to, you know, the phrase deploy at scale, right? The internet. We're developing standards here that run over the whole internet and through the whole internet. So scalability is very definitely important. Security, in the past few years, has become more important to the IETF. So we see things like end-to-end encryption, TLS encrypting more and more data. Time is important. You don't want to be able to send someone's clock back in the past and replay old messages. So that's got more security and so on. And then there's many working groups devoted to operational issues. The domain system is complicated, and getting that properly deployed and operating, there are hints for how to do stuff. Okay, next slide, please. So, what is the IETF? We are a standards development organization, SDO. Other ones you might have heard of are W3C, OASIS, ANSI, ECMA, ETSI, ITU is another big global one. We're different from almost all of those. The way you join an IETF working group is you sign up for the mailing list. If it's one of the more recent working groups, you can just follow the repo on GitHub, for example, and get comments that way. There's no formal government role. There's no formal voting. We don't, and if we were doing this face-to-face, I'd run a sample one at the end of the meeting, but we hum. And how we hum virtually is, we're trying to work out the details, but humming has the advantage, and of course, there's an RFC on it. You can't tell who's humming. You can't look at a raised hands and say, oh yeah, I'm gonna vote like he did, because we're both in the same company. And you can't tell who's humming yes or who's humming no. It's very difficult. It's driven by market-based adoption, meaning a standard is only useful if it's used. Okay, if it's somebody, we tried to look at if we should develop a standard for internet file systems, and after one meeting, we said nope, because nobody's interested in working with us on it. So we have, you know, Dropbox and all of the other companies are all doing their own thing. Bottom up means the individuals who are on the working group and are writing the documents, that's the product. And that's why we say we're bottom up. Next slide, please. So the IETF has divided itself into what's currently seven 7 technical areas. And I won't read this eye chart. They have shifted around over time. We've created new areas. We have merged some into others and so on. So it's a malleable structure. Every area has 2 or 3 area directors. The bottom one, Gen, is general, and that's devoted to the IETF itself. So that's where we have RFCs and working groups discussing how we pick venues for meeting, how we decide who can be on the nominating committee and so on. And that's just run by one person, the general chair. Sorry, the IETF chair is the area director for Gen, but all of the others have 2 or 3 people who have got, for the most part, years of knowledge on these things. Okay. Next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about humming and consensus. Pardon me. So the IETF really likes this phrase. It came from Dave Clark, a research professor at MIT, very much involved in the early days of the ARPANET and its follow on the internet. We reject kings, presidents, and voting, meaning it's consensus. And we believe in rough consensus and running code. In other words, nobody's ahead of anybody else. Something that can be deployed has a big advantage. Rough consensus is interesting. It doesn't mean we all agree, and it doesn't mean that we've necessarily compromised, but it means that all of the points were raised, and if somebody says, well, this is bad because of ABC, the working group can decide, well, yeah, we see your point, but we disagree with you. So it doesn't have to be that everything was addressed, and it doesn't have to mean that everybody has compromised. It just means that all the concerns have been heard, not necessarily accommodated, but heard. And that's very different from, say, the ones I'm familiar with, ANSI and ITU, right? Which is very much, you'll have voting, and you'll have to make sure to, make the standards more flexible, or OASIS, I guess, so that everybody will, vote yes. Okay. Humming, it's a way to get the temperature of the room. It's anonymous. Nobody raises their hand, as I mentioned before, and it's up to the working group chairs, who will be either are the owners of the video presentation or in face-to-face or sitting at the front of the room, to listen with the help of their area director and determine which way the consensus goes. The RFC mentioned there, 7282, it's interesting and fun to read. If you just typed IETF RFC 7282 into Bing, Google, DuckDuckGo, whatever, it'll come up. One of the first couple links that will come up will be a copy of it, and the official links to the formal documents, which are the same as what you'll find on the net, are available in the slides. Okay, one more. Let's go on to the next one.
The next one beyond this one, because you've been talking about this already.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. So the alphabet soup, this is sort of where the pieces that make up the IETF. The IESG, and I'll talk about more of this on the next slide. That's all the area directors I mentioned a couple slides ago. Each area has 2 or 3 directors. Collectively, they're the IESG, and you can see that blue circle on the right-hand side, divided in the areas, and working groups are all within an area. And the working groups have a charter, and they are chartered to work on a particular technology, HTTP, network time, the border gateway protocol, things like that. The IRTF, which is shown on the pink circle on the right there, although it's, RSG, is the same kind of thing, but not producing documents or standards that affect the operation of the internet. They're looking a little further out. It follows all of the same rules and structures and so on, It's separate but the same kind of thing, and it meets the same time the IETF does. The IIB takes a longer term role. The LLC, I'll mention, that's a business corporation, the kind of corporation in the US. The RFC editor in green produces our documents, and IANA handles some of the paper pushing. So let's look on the next slide. We'll get into a little more detail about who does what. So as I said, the ISG, all the area directors meet, they get a last chance to review anything that would be published. They often have feedback, and that goes back to the working group or the document authors. They can, block something, say a discuss, meaning, hey, I didn't understand what you meant by this. You should clarify this. So it's a really useful last minute review by folks who might have a wider horizon. The IETF I mentioned is a parallel structure. The IAB provides oversight, longer term things. They run programs such as the RFC editor. So the ISG is focused on technical and when organizing the meetings in person. And the IAB handles longer scale things. The LLC, Limited Liability Corporation, it's a US construct, legal construct. It's the legal home. So when somebody has to sign a contract with a hotel, saying, oh yeah, we're gonna, please reserve 1,000 rooms for us. You need somebody a legal entity to sign that. Taking donations, things like that. It's a charitable organization, so tax deductible. Okay, all right, so yeah, so just looking at the chat before we go on to the next section. Yeah, let's just see. So how do you remember most or all of the RFCs? I don't know anybody who does. People will remember the ones that are in their area or things that they're interested in. Many people know particular ones that define the operations of the IETF. But I mean, I've been around for, too many years. And I'll come to a meeting and all of a sudden someone will stand up and go, well, as we said in RFC 2612, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, how do you even remember those numbers? You just don't, and then people are often, sitting there typing at their laptop, RFC 2612 and calling it up and go, oh yeah, that's the one that defines may, must, should, shall. But there are many people, and there's a joke we can talk about some other time about that, don't remember all the RFCs. You have to, and often an RFC will say, oh, this updates a previous one, or this obsoletes a whole bunch of other ones. So you only have to care about, the latest one. I'm about to turn it over to Karen. So I just wondered, any other questions on this section?
I think we've been catching them as we go.
Great.
There is some discussion in here about rough consensus, but we've talked about it some, so I think we can get back to it at the end if there's any more questions. So
sure.
All right. So I'm going to talk about basically what all the various pieces are that happen during an actual IETF week, and to understand this, this is what often goes on in person, and then there's going to be some variations on that because we are currently in a virtual environment. So basically, the organized events during the agenda would be your working group sessions. We have approximately 130 working groups, and some subset of those will be meeting during the main IETF week. We also have birds of a feather sessions, which are focused on specific bringing new work to the IETF or one-time topics. I'll talk a little bit more about those later. We have a number of IRTF sessions, and there's a little bit of discussion in the chat about that. So we have the IETF, which is the Engineering Task Force, and then we have the IRTF, which is the Research Task Force. So this is for, as Rich indicated, this is for work that's not quite mature enough yet to develop deployable standards on it. But there are a number of groups, but they are working through proposals and publishing documents. And the research groups are generally speaking open, and some subset of them will also meet during an IETF week. And then there's area-wide sessions. So Rich mentioned that the areas, you had like the security area, the transport area. So sometimes you'll have meetings that are across a single area. And then you might have the IETF-wide plenaries or invited lunch talks or things like that, which are across all of the areas or the whole IETF. There's also generally a hackathon and a code sprint. I'll talk a little bit more about those. There's usually social events, and then there will be some tutorials or deep dives. Sometimes there is something called the Hot RFC Lightning Talks. And then there's also side meetings and open time. And so we'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. There's a number of things that generally are not on the agenda, including your hallway meetings, bar-boffs, which are basically really informal meetings where you're getting your colleagues together to start work potentially, that will eventually turn into a real BOF, and then editing sessions. There is an app, and even with the virtual environment that we're currently in, the app has been updated for this IETF. And then finally, the data tracker is sort of it's really the repository of all the IETF documents and all the work. And so you really want to pay attention to the agenda. I see the question in the thing about IRTF sessions, and they are also part of the IETF agenda page, and you'll be able to identify them on the data tracker as being an IRTF session versus an IETF session, but they will be all on the same agenda page. So IETF109, which is one coming up here in a couple of weeks, is going to be all online. And there'll be a few activities the week before, but the bulk of the IETF will be the 16th to the 20th of November. The newcomer overview, and this is one of those, and also some Meet Echo training sessions are being held this week. So Meet Echo is the tool that we use. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. That's the tool that we use for the meeting itself, the virtual meeting. And there are some training sessions for participants, and that'll be on the participants guide. I believe they have been scheduled at this point, but keep an eye out for those. There is a hackathon, and it's going to be the week before the IETF, and there's some more information about that later on. And so that's actually next week. And then there's Newcomers Quick Connection, which is going to be the week before as well. We made the decision early on to, when we moved to virtual meetings, to keep the rough time frame with what it would have been where the meeting was originally hosted. So this meeting was originally planned for Bangkok in Thailand, and therefore it's going to be during hours that would be like normal working hours for Thailand. So it's going to be 0500 to 1100 UTC. As I already mentioned, all of the session information will be linked from the agenda page. There are informal side meetings, which are not on the agenda page, and it's on the side meetings. Anybody can go into the wiki and edit it and schedule a side meeting. And then you're free to announce it on whatever mailing list makes sense. So if you want to have a side meeting, for example, a side meeting on, next generation NTP security, you could go in and you could schedule that. And then you'd probably want to announce that one on the NTP mailing list and say, hey, I'm going to have a side meeting, come join me. And here's the details for that. All of the information on how to participate is here. And this session participant guide is where you will find the links for the Meet Echo training sessions that'll be held. And then we've already talked a little bit about this. This is your newcomer specific activities. So The bulk of the IETF is obviously all the working groups. Most of the work in a working group is done on a mailing list in between the meetings. Face-to-face meetings or you know, face-to-face or virtual meetings are generally focused on solving key issues. So a lot of what you'll see this week or in 2 weeks will be a document being discussed, and then the key things, you know, the key issues that are still stumbling blocks is what will be discussed, not like an overview of the whole document itself. We do have, working groups can also have virtual interim meetings that will not be during the weeks. And so, for example, in a working group I'm involved in, you know, they probably meet once or twice between every full IETF meeting and a virtual standalone meeting. And you can find a list of all of the virtual meetings that are coming up on the main IETF webpage under meetings. A working group will have a charter which has milestones, and it's been negotiated with the area director and approved by the IESG. So the birds of a feather sessions, there's another slide later on that specifically talks about bringing new work to the IETF, but generally a birds of a feather session excuse me, precedes the formation of a working group, and it usually it's usually focused on questions around scope and focus of a charter, and whether or not there is enough critical mass within the IETF to pursue a new work item. Occasionally there will be birds of a feather sessions for topics that are not planning to become a working group. They're just, you know, it's a topic that's of general interest to the IETF, or it's a one-time discussion. There is a process for applying to have a working group declared as a BOF, and you submit a write-up for your BOF, and then the IESG reviews all of them and approves them or not. And you can request, if you're interested in bringing new work, you can actually request help in shepherding a BOF through the process, and somebody will be assigned to help you do that. So we already talked a little bit about the fact that we have the working groups for the IETF, and then we have the research groups for the IRTF. The IRTF is officially an activity of the IAB, and they are generally, as I've indicated, they're more research topics versus actual engineering topics. All IRTF meetings at an IETF are open meetings. And this RFC 7418 talks a great deal about more about the IRTF. So we talked here about area-wide sessions, plenaries, and invited lunch talks. I think if you're interested in topics that go across the area, you want to look for the area meetings. So for example, the Security Area Advisory Group meets usually on the Thursday of the meeting. And it has topics that are of general interest to security. Sometimes an area will have like the Transport Area Working Group, and then they'll have a Transport Area meeting. So part of the meeting will be, you know, specific work items that have been accepted for the work for the working group, for the Transport Area Working Group, and then it'll have general topics. We have two types of plenaries, and sometimes they can occur together, and sometimes not at all. Every IETF will have an administrative plenary, and this is where we go through basically the business of the IETF. And so they'll talk about the budget, they'll talk about upcoming meetings, and it's also a chance for the IETF community to ask questions of all of the IETF leadership bodies. There can also be a technical plenary. These are generally organized by the IAB on technical topics that are of general interest to the IETF. There may or may not be a technical plenary for any specific given IETF. It just depends. In the virtual world, we haven't done the invited lunch talks as much as we have for physical meetings. A lot of times if we have for example, a sponsor, and they might offer a high-level technical speaker, and that'll provide a technical talk. So hackathons and code sprints. Hackathon has grown into a large activity, generally the weekend before the IETF at a physical meeting, where any group of people that are interested in working on a project might work together on it. Code sprints is really basically the same thing as a hackathon, except it is specifically looking at the development of the tools that the IETF uses. So this is a volunteer team that gets together and develops things like tools.ietf.org and data tracker and things like that. I'll talk a little bit more about the hackathon. So the hackathon is free and open to anybody to participate, whether you're registered for the IETF or not. And it's intended to be collaborative and working towards shared goals. Part of what it's trying to do is get the IETF a little bit back to its roots on, rough consensus and running code, and sort of re-emphasizing the running code piece of it. Some of this might be, somebody who has a new idea for something that might eventually become a standard, and they will propose a project and people will work on that, and then they can decide whether it's something that's worth pursuing in the IETF or not. It might also be a working group that's currently working on a solution to something, and they can use the hackathon as a sort of a feedback mechanism into the specification, so that you do some implementation work during the hackathon, you figure out where the holes are in the specification, and then you feed that back into the working group, and the working group improves the document. Or you thought you had a solution correct, and then you tried to implement it and you realized that you overlooked something, and then you can update that. So it helps improve the quality of the standards that are coming out, and it also helps keep the momentum going and getting a standard through the process. It's one of the biggest areas where we see a lot of newcomers coming in. Generally speaking, the percentage of people at a hackathon that are newcomers is going to be higher than the percentage of people in a regular IETF meeting that are newcomers. There's additional information available about hackathons at this link. Obviously the hackathon next week will be a online only. So then there's networking and social events. So we don't really have social events in the same way in a virtual meeting as we do in a physical meeting. We do have a social platform that provides a little bit a virtual version of what is often called the hallway track. And Rich will talk a little bit more about that in the next section. Using a tool called gather.town, and this gives you an opportunity for more casual interactions. It will also be the tool that we'll be using for the newcomers quick connections if you decide to come to that. It basically, if you get within a small radius of people, then that set of people will be on, can interact, with audio and video. And then you can move away and join another group and connect to that group. In addition to like general social events, there's also groups of people, and the picture on the right is actually an informal organization called Sisters, which is to help provide connectivity and networking for the women in the IETF. And so generally we get together and have a lunch one day during an IETF meeting. So I want to talk a little bit about general meeting etiquette. As I mentioned before, working groups are generally, when you come to an IETF meeting and you step into a working group for the first time, you're stepping into work that's already been in progress for a while. And so one of the first things that you really need to do is to sort of read the documents of interest before the working group session. So this will give you a chance of understanding and participating in the conversations better. As always, behave respectfully and tolerantly towards all participants. Talk and listen to people and enjoy yourself. I'm not exactly sure how remembering to sleep applies in this world, but in this virtual environment, but there you have it. So for the online version, I think we're all, what, 7 or 8 months into participating in virtual meetings, so I think we've pretty much got this down at this point. But you want to practice good online meeting practices. Test your configuration in advance. The IETF does use, I mean, we're using Zoom tonight, but we do use a custom tool. So there's a lot of materials available to help you make sure that you can use that tool effectively. Keep yourself muted and the video off, except when speaking. It helps if you use a headset, and always speak slowly, clearly, and be concise. Technical comments and questions are always welcome, provided you've done your homework. There is also a working group Jabber channel, and Rich will talk a little bit more about that in the tools session. So finally, in this section, a lot of times newcomers are coming into the IETF and they're particularly interested in bringing new work in. And so there's some real basic steps that will help you be more successful at that. One is to, you need to find some collaborators that have a similar interest, because one of the keys to being successful in the IETF is to have something that has support from multiple constituencies. Write some initial drafts, maybe have a barb off, and then talk to the area directors in the relevant area. Some areas have a working group called a dispatch working group. And this is a working group that basically looks at all sorts of incoming proposals and then does a really quick, is this of interest to the area? And if so, what should we do with it? Does it belong in this working group? Should we suggest a new working group be spun up? And then hold a BOF. I see a question in there about what is a bar BOF. A bar BOF is a very informal gathering before you have any official meetings, and it's called a bar BOF because historically, it was kind of there's 4 or 5 people and we're really interested in this topic. Let's meet down at the bar at 7 and discuss it. So it's become a term that basically means a really informal meeting. And so it can be one of those informal side meetings that you schedule with the wiki, or it could be, it's not going to have official agenda time, but it's any way that you find to gather collaborators together to explore your idea. And if you think of in terms of, you often hear stories of early internet technology and a couple of folks sitting in a bar with a napkin and drawing up a design for a new protocol. That's the idea behind a bar BOF. Great. So hold the BOF, consent, and then consensus will determine what happens as a result of the BOF. There is a whole tutorial on bringing new work to the IETF, and here's the slides and the video for that tutorial. So now we're at the 3rd section. I think we're pretty caught up on questions. So Rich, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about some of the key people and roles that are involved, just some general information and tooling that, that we haven't already covered. So next slide, please. So the first group of people is obviously us, those of us who are participating. That would be all of you folks out there, Karen and me, and thousands of others. A typical IETF in person will have you know, 1,000 people in a hotel, 1,000 plus people in a hotel for a week. The online tend to have several hundred because people tend to drop in and out for just the meetings that they, you know, they want to know. As Karen said, the people are, you know, when you come to a meeting, these are the people who've been working on it between meetings. So they're passionate, they're vocal. They can be obnoxious, but that's because, you know, looking at the bottom right one, we've known each other for a long time, and we're also very friendly. Nobody's caught up on roles and titles. Everybody represents themselves as an individual. So on the next slide, I'll talk about some of the resources, but the key thing is, if you know your stuff, if you know the technology, or you're willing to learn, you just sit back and watch for a while, that's it. You're part of the group. Don't worry about it. People dress comfortably, but, you know, business casual or sometimes less, but, you know, they dress. We talk to each other frankly and openly, and socializing is a big part of it, which obviously takes a hit during these times. Next slide, please. So looking, you know, we said the organization is, you know, bottom up directed in terms of the work items are determined by the people who want to work on them. Either there's a working group for it, or there is a birds of a feather bath for informal first gatherings to do it. And then the layers above, the working group chairs. Every working group has 1 or 2, sometimes 3 chairs whose job is to keep the process flowing. They're not there to act as the ultimate technical resources for the working group. If a working group chair wants to say something, they'll sort of say, okay, speaking as an individual, or the common phrase it uses, with no hats, meaning I take off the hat that says I'm a chair, and now I'm speaking as an individual. I think we should do this. Working groups are organized, as I showed earlier, into areas. So the area directors will typically unless there's a conflict, attend the working groups that they're responsible for. And then there's the general IETF chair, currently Alyssa Cooper, employee of Cisco. And if you have a problem and you don't think that the process is being followed, or you think that you're not getting proper recognition for something that you contributed, or that people aren't listening to you, start with the working group chairs. If the working group chairs are, you know, not going well, speak to the area director, and ultimately you could speak to Alyssa. We want to stop it as low on the totem, you know, as low on the process as possible. Next slide, please. Jay is the, you know, we're a volunteer organization. Jay is a paid employee professional who handles survey tabulation, negotiating with hotels, negotiating with contractors who do the tooling and so on. All around nice guy, even if he's from, you know, New Zealand. Okay, next slide, please. And I'm just joking, I just like him. The secretariat. These people, mostly women, you can see them here, like at the beginning of the week, they're all in blue. On Friday, when the thing ends, they're all wearing Hawaiian shirts. They handle the registration, they handle meeting conflicts, they run some of the IESG meetings, for example. They run some of the other meetings, such as they take the minutes, for example, when we were having when Karen and I were meeting with Secretariat and some of the other people to plan the Newcomers events. These folks take minutes, keep it all on track. They're great. Next slide. The RFC editor and the INA staff. So the RFC editor, also called the RFC Production Center. They do the final copy editing on the documents, make sure everything is clear, all the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed, that the graphics translate if there's any, and that the references to other RFCs are all handled. So if we say an RFC, this RFC obsoletes that one, then they go back and change it so that the old one says obsoleted by the new one. They're great. IANA, many RFCs have spaces in them for expansion, let's call it, where, for example, DNS will say, here's a query, and you might know A or quad A, 4As, is a general address lookup. Then there's a kind of, I want to look up the host that's responsible for the mail. And there's a collection of those kinds of things where there's holes in the protocol that other fields could be filled in later. That's, a lot of that is IANA, the Internet Assigned Network Numbers Authority. The fact that HTTP is on port 80 and HTTPS is on port 443, those records are maintained by IANA. The best thing about them when we meet face to face is, as you can see on the tables here, they have lots of candy, so you grab a quick snack. Also very friendly people. And they work for the most part with the same organization that runs the Secretariat. Next slide. The Ombuds team. If something goes wrong on a personal level, as opposed to like a process or a technical level, we don't tolerate harassment or harassment. We don't allow it. We dislike it, and we will, tell people, remove people from mailing lists and so on if they are doing these kinds of things. These three people, Allison, Pete, and Melinda. Pete is obviously the one in the middle. We have an anti-harassment policy, and if you feel that you're being harassed, or if you notice that someone is writing really objectionable material to you personally, contact them. And there's an RFC for it. You can contact these people. You can look them up in the data tracker and find their addresses and so on. We hope it doesn't happen. The number of incidents where this happens is very, very small, but we want to make sure that we're really, welcoming and open to all without fear. Next slide. So newcomers resources, the DAO of the IETF. This is an old historic document. It was just recently refreshed by, I think, Niels, that explains the way of the IETF, and is full of, not too many Zen cones, but things like rough consensus and running code and so on. It's a fairly short read. It's good. I think you've seen the newcomers page about 3 times so far, plus you've also gotten it in mail. Karen mentioned in the past, we've had technical tutorials. This tutorial will show up in video at some point. It's being recorded and uploaded to YouTube later on. So you can see that the other tutorials are available. And for the most part, many of them are still applicable and interesting. The service, discovering services through DNS tricks was done by Apple. It's very cool. Next slide. So more meeting resources. There is a first-time attendees mailing list. That's the page to the archive and the list. Feel free to join it. The sisters group for women, or those who present as women, a socially oriented thing, but also designed to be a welcoming space for, to help a welcoming space for women, leave it at that. There are many meeting lists, many mailing lists about meetings, social lists, travel companions. That tends to not be that important in these virtual days. But when we meet face to face, there'll often be things like, hey, anybody, I'm landing at 6 p.m. on Friday night. Anybody want to share a cab to the hotel? That kind of discussion. Next slide, please. Okay, the data tracker. So that's named there in the upper left, and the picture screenshot is in the right. Also known as DT, so abbreviated dt.ietf.org. This has pages for, this handles the workflow and the document storage for the IETF. So you see on the right here, the TLS working group. There's tabs for about, that would be the general discussion. Documents, this is the drafts that are currently being worked, what the status is. when we meet and what the minutes are and the slides are and so on, history of various other documents. And if you, the list archive is the not unintuitively named one that gets you to the mailing list. The most important URL construct is dt.ietf.org/wg/ and then the working group abbreviation, TLS/wg/ntp and so on. The tools page has a bunch of links and tools and text for helping produce drafts, document them, format them, and so on. You won't need that at the start, but the data tracker is definitely a way to start up. You can say, oh, I'm interested in this group. And when you look at the agenda, there'll be a link for every working group that points to its data tracker page. Next slide. Meet Echo. This is the video tool that we use for remote participation. When we meet in person, it starts with they have video cameras set up in the back of the room and mics, and that stuff is broadcast over the internet in real time. There's also recordings made. It has the messaging system, Jabber, or known as XMPP, built in. It has the ability to handle people who are presenting remotely. Obviously, we all are now, so it's like, these are the 4 folks who have, are key in it. Tobiah is the guy Karen and I have spent the most time with because he generally handles all of the newcomers webinars. Since this is a newcomers session, we made the decision to switch to Zoom because we figured newcomers are probably more familiar with that than the IETF tool. There are practice sessions available, and there's a session participant guide which shows how to use the tool. There is, I mentioned humming, and there's a way for you to click on a button when the chairs are doing a hum, and what will come out based on how people clicked is there'll be, pianissimo all the way up to sforzando, right? Those happen to be the Italian musical terms for soft and loud, and it will help. So it's kind of cute that way. Next page, GatherTown. So this is where we have our virtual hallway. It's a startup that has done some things to make it more flexible for us. You can see on the left, here's where meeting rooms are. It's kind of, I think of it as the IETF Animal Crossing. When you get 2 people together, videos of the people participating show up at the top, and you can talk and you can hear, and it's next best thing to being there. The newcomers tutorial, the newcomers meet and greet will happen in here. You'll see email coming from the IETF either to the all participants and also the newcomers mailing list about what the links are and how to join. Gather.town/something or other. I don't know. But I was impressed. It's more fun than I thought. Yeah, next slide. Not as good as Animal Crossing, but still good. So we use XMPP. There's an RFC describes it. It is an instant messaging protocol. We're trying to figure out what to do. We'll have experiments up that use other things like Slack or Zulip, or I forget what the third one is. So there'll be email about that. But pardon me. Yeah. So watch email for those things. Next slide. Above all else, have a good time. I know almost all of the people in these pictures by now. This was the middle one with the fireworks was pretty impressive. That was in Prague, where they did a really impressive social event that had fireworks, which is cool. Okay, so we're just about out of time. In fact, we're just about to go over. We have a survey, or you can click on the QR code there on the right. If you have other questions, you can come to the next webinar. Otherwise, email the edu-team at ietf.org. And thank you for your time. If there's any last minute questions, we can stay for a minute or two. Otherwise, we'll end more or less on time.
Yes, thank you everybody for coming, and yes, the next webinar will be the same topics. It's the same presentation actually. So
Right.
we do it at 2 different times to accommodate people in different time zones.
Yeah.
There will also be a Slack channel, and we will add that. It's not currently in the documentation, but there will be a Newcomers channel as part of our Slack channel space, and you'll be able to ask newcomer questions there during the week.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and hope to see you around online in a couple weeks.
And thank you very much for attending. Everybody have a good night.